So it's of course the biggest concern of everybody today. We're having this barbarian attack on of this caveman, and I don't know what to tell. But what we try to understand today is A, the dynamics of war, and B, the kind of global context and Ukrainian occupation. Would you guide us through, in your understanding of imperialism, the strategies,
Yeah,
how
yeah,
Ukraine dealt with them, and generally,
yeah.
how is it going now?
Thank you for this question, and I'm glad that we have this conversation also in the framework of our project on the war, on the wars in Europe. Sadly, this is a kind of a new addition, a new situation that will add to this project. I wish it would have never happened, but it's happening. It's really something unthinkable and unbelievable. I would say that the coverage in the media, which is quite extensive, quite good, cannot cover the things that happen on the ground. It's like a shocking situation, like a nightmare, essentially, from which you want to wake up, and you can't, and you know that you will never wake up from this nightmare. Um, Certainly, people who never experience something like that can never really understand what is going on. And probably people in Georgia can understand us better than many other, if any other, European nation. And I think, as never before, we understand the people of Georgia these days. Um, um, yes, if we judge from media, we probably can see the war in Ukraine as coming out of blue, out of sudden. And indeed, it was something unthinkable. Indeed, it is a real, huge, murderous war in Europe for decades. Of course, there was the war in Georgia, there was the war in Armenia, which are somehow in the same line. But the scale of this war is really huge. For us Ukrainians, however, it's not really like a peak on the oscillogram that emerges out of nothing. For us, it's just an escalation of the war through which we have been living through since 2014. So that for us, it's not the beginning of the war. It's just the continuation of the war. It's really a stage of the war that we never expected to happen. At the same time, the framework for this war, the rationale, if you want. It's really strange to speak about the rationale of the war, because there cannot be. We understand that it's kind of insane, illogical to assume any rationale in the war, and still there is one. Something that I try to kind of to grasp, to understand, and I think we try to do this in this project together. So this underpinning of the war, ideological frame, I prefer to call it ideological frame of the war, remains the same. The actors remain the same, including Mr. Putin, who waged the initial stage of this war in 2014. On the one hand, on the one side, and on the other side, the Ukrainian people, who are the other part of the actors in this war. My hermeneutical approach to this war is that it's not really a war in the classical sense, given especially that it has never been declared formally. So from the Putin's perspective, it's a special operation in Ukraine to denazify Ukraine. For us, for me personally, it's just a continuation of the Maidans. I call it the Maidan number 3, which continues a series of public manifestations which took place in Ukraine. Arguably, it can be also called Maidan number 4, because some people say that the Maidans, the series of the Maidans, started with the students' revolution. It is also called the granite revolution. It took place in the early 90s when the students came to protest against the communist regime in Ukraine. And they managed, well, to some extent, to change the political climate in Ukraine. And certainly they laid out the foundations for the further um, public revolts, including the one in 2004, known as the Orange Revolution. Then the Revolution of Dignity 2014, and now I would call that the events of 2022 is just the kind of climax, apotheosis of the series of the public manifestations, with the same purpose to protect the transformations within the society, the Ukrainian society, the transformations that happen as an evolution, I would say. So the Maidans, as such, they are not really revolutions. They are the means to protect the evolution within the Ukrainian society towards democratization, and I would call towards the ideal of republicanism, a political model which is opposite, incompatible with the political model promulgated and promoted and protected by Putin, the monarchical model, the autocratic model. And yes, again, we have to protect our ideals, the evolution that is going on within Ukraine. So that would be my very broad framework to explain the hermeneutical frame, if you want, to explain what is going on. And of course, probably you will ask now in the conversation about the religious dimension, because I think it is still strong, as it was very strong in the previous Maidans. So it is strong in this Maidan number 3.
Yeah, and of course it's interesting. I mean, how Putin, when he was announcing this in a very confusive interview, which was cut off at the end, and also with this kind of the meeting of this federal council, he was referring to some religious components, the idea of Russian world in a way, and you wrote that in the blog for our religion and praxis. So I wonder if you can elaborate on the Russian world idea, how that
Yeah.
works on the level of soft power politics, on the level of religious dimension of it. And you theorize that in your book on orthodoxies, political orthodoxies. In a way, you wrote it extensively in other places. But I'm wondering, how would that be a kind of a feature by which Russian foreign policy justifies this war and under which it maybe framed this war?
Yeah, well, I agree, and certainly you are correct in referring to the Russian world ideology, which I think is the framing ideology for the entire Putin's regime. I should say that the Putin's regime did not start with this ideology. It did not. It was not propelled to power by this ideology, but certainly it realized at some point that this ideology can be useful for this regime to preserve itself. So it is an ideology of self-preservation or self-reproduction for Putin's regime. I've been speaking and writing about this ideology since it actually was adopted by the Russian Church and elaborated upon by the Russian Church. I worked then in the Russian Church and was very close to those people who started refurbishing this ideology, which they borrowed actually from the liberal circles in the Russian society in the 1990s. The original idea of the Russian world was that we believe, they said, a group of political scientists, including people like Shedrovitsky and his followers, the so-called methodological school, I think, in the Russian social philosophy, if you want. So they essentially assume that the core of modern Russia at that time, in the 90s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is weak, cannot sustain itself, cannot provide itself with meanings. Why should we exist? And it doesn't have cadres, people who would help this core to develop, to sustain itself, and to integrate into the international community. So they realized that the brightest people, Russians, uh, they had to leave, were forced or decided to leave Russia and to go outside to the periphery of Russia, as it were, to the Western countries, to the East, wherever. And they constitute essentially the brain of the Russian civilization. That was the point of the original Russian world. So they suggested that in order to sustain the Russian civilization, this civilization needs to use its peripheral powers, concentrated on the periphery, uh, sometimes outside Russia. And they need to bring the potentiality and the skills of the periphery of those Russian brains spread across the universe, across the world, around Russia, to make the Russian existence meaningful again. Um, so it was essentially a centripetal uh, movement ideology. Then in the 2000s, something happened to this ideology. It was reused and, as I said, refurbished, and it received a completely different dynamics. Now this dynamics was centrifugal. That people began to believe that no, it's not the periphery which is the strength of the Russian world, of the Russian civilization. It is the center, people who live in the center. And they are able to produce ideas and project power to the outside, to the West. And they are able to change the world around this Russian world, uh, to reshape it according to the ideals of the Russian world. So this ideology was centrifugal. As I said, it was designed to project ideas, Russian ideas and values, what they would come later on to call traditional values to the world outside. The crucial role in this transformation of the dynamics, of this U-turn of the dynamics, was played by the Russian church. And I think at the moment when this dynamics changed its direction, I believe it became dangerous. It became an ideological frame for the neo-imperial project. And you were right by referring to this imperialism, this imperial project which we observe nowadays. I should mention that I had friends in the early 2000s when this ideology began emerging, who were quite liberal in the church and open-minded, and they're still open-minded. And I was quite surprised that they were kind of advocating for the liberal empire. Yes, they wanted it liberal, but still they wanted it to be an empire. And this idea of an empire is very much pertinent, I believe, to the mentality among the figures, including the intellectuals in the Russian church who contributed to the production of this formation of this ideology of the Russian world. And of course, as long as the Putin's regime became more conservative or looked for non-liberal patterns of existence, the Russian church came to serve him and to offer him ideas which are conservative, and they articulated those ideas in the terms of the traditional values, and also connected it with the ideology of the Russian world. So now the Russian world was not the world of peripheries. It was the world of the center, of the core of the Russian civilization that had the so-called spiritual staples, духовные скрепы, as it was called, which would contain to sustain the integrity of the Russian society, and moreover to project the ideas, these principles of sustainability of the Russian society to the outside. And they became a tool of the reintegration, as they believe, of the former Soviet territories back to the neo-Russian, neo-empire of Putin. That's how this kind of combination of elements happened. The imperial project, on the one hand, and the Russian world as an ideology which was originally liberal, then became conservative and became kind of underpinning or became underpinned by the conservative agenda, and they together constituted this complex ideological mechanism which Putin uses now to pursue his goals.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and I'm of course wondering about the persons who are running these things. You mentioned in our blog about probably Putin. What does he even think? What kind of Christian is he, and what kind of theologies? I mean, he employs in a way. I mean, would you elaborate for the people who will be reading this more like a little bit insight from your experience of working closely in the Russian church? What is the attitude towards him among the clergy? Among what does the patriarch Kirill think of him, or how do these people see him, and how do you think what kind of people he is? Who is Putin Christ in a way?
Yeah, yeah, that's a very good way to put the question that you want to ask. Just give me a second. I need to check out another meeting. It's going to happen. What time? Don't want to miss it. Just 1 second. Yeah, we still have time. Um, right. Yes. Yes. Putin himself. I believe initially, I don't know him personally, of course, and he had many, he had, he didn't have many opportunities, or didn't have much desire to disclose what he believes. Really, I would assume that he didn't believe anything. He didn't have any ideological um, frame in his policies. Moreover, I think maybe in the beginning he had some kind of aversion to any ideology, because certainly it's very clear that he is frustrated. He was frustrated with the communist ideology, even though he was a communist member of the Communist Party. But as most those small members of the Communist Party, he didn't believe in the ideals. He was just using them, and certainly his frustration is very clear. Like for instance, this frustration is clear from his kind of landmark address, which he made on the 21st of February this year, 2022, before the open invasion to Ukraine, when he gave a long lecture on the way how he sees Russia and its place in the world. And I think this was one of really rare opportunities for us to peek into his mind, to open kind of his skull and to look into his brain. And there he disclosed that he hated apparently the communist ideology. So I believe at some point he was disappointed in any ideology. And then he was brought back to thinking ideologically. And that is my belief. This is my kind of hypothesis, if you want, by the church. It somehow interfered with his coming back to some sort of spirituality, which is another interesting and difficult topic to analyze. What sort of spirituality it was, and I try to touch on this in my blog, published with you. It can be another question, but what is important to understand now that he had some kind of spirituality. Some people say, and he did not kind of denounce those statements that the current Metropolitan of Pskov, Tikhon Shevkunov, was his spiritual father, even though I doubt that, but certainly Tikhon Shevkunov was interested and is interested in sustaining those rumors, and Putin never denounced them. Some other people who were close to Putin, like the now refugee dissident banker Pugachev, who fled to France, from Putin's Russia, who was a very close friend, that probably he contributed very much to the initiation of Putin to some kind of orthodox, or I would say quasi-orthodox spirituality. He also made some disclosures, and he actually stated that this sort of orthodoxy of Putin is very superficial. It's very much uh, aligned to it. He's very much just using it without really practicing it. Um, so my own take on it is that this kind of spirituality that Putin adopted in the process of his conversion to whatever it is, whatever kind of religion it is, concurred with this initiation back to the ideological framework. And this happened under the influence of some influential hierarchs of the Russian church, I believe, including Patriarch Kirill himself, who played, I think, a key role in constructing or reconstructing this ideology of the Russian world, and in converting most of the Russian establishment, political establishment, to this ideology. So I think the church is a key player. I mean, at least the leadership of the Russian church, particularly represented by Patriarch Kirill, are key figures in making this ideology, producing this ideology, and making this ideology the main framework for the Russian policies during the last decade.
And a very good point here is that what sort of you were talking about this, his beliefs maybe in numerisms and those kind of things. Again, 8th of August, 22nd of these things are
not just 8th of August. It's 8th
of August 2008.
Of 28. Yes, in Georgia.
Exactly. Yeah. So there is this sense of this sort of the weird, at the end of the day, kind of this weird features of, I don't know, beliefs and system of beliefs which are combined in this sort of mythological figure. And to go into the questions which our readers probably appreciate will be the global dimensions of this war. I mean, of course, we talked about it in a private setting with other colleagues and friends that, well, it's not about Ukraine. It's actually about the world, and it's about global human rights. And absolutely, there is no guarantee that the next time it will not be Warsaw or Stockholm. It's just a test, which is, again, if it fails, the next one will be something else. These are things actually which we're discussing everywhere. I'm wondering, what does it actually change? What does the occupation of Ukraine change in the grand scheme of things, in the kind of a bigger politics? And what's your take on this whole broader dimension of this war?
Yeah, well, I think that Putin thinks of himself as a global actor. Well, quite apparent. I think no one will doubt it. And I would put it in more dramatic terms: his self-perception and his take on history, because he has a historiosophy. He is a historiosopher in a sense. He has his own philosophy of history. I would call it a myth of history, but it's a matter of taste, how one takes it. So he has ideas about about a history. He certainly has envisaged for himself a place in this history, and he acts from the perspective of his seeing himself in this history. It's a very interesting kind of perspective, if you want. So he looks at himself as a historical figure in third person, if you want, from the perspective of a handbook in the Russian history, or global history, written by himself. And I believe to a great extent, he is a hostage of this vision. And what kind of handbook of history it is, we could conclude again from this address on the 21st of February, where he exposed very in much detail, I would say, his look at the history, his outlook at the history, the way how he sees it. And this is certainly a history which resembles somehow, if you want, well, Christian scriptures. Like if you take Paul's statement to the Christians that your fight is not against the powers of this world. Your fight is against the demons, the demonic forces. So Paul suggested an outlook at the history where the global existential metaphysical evil tries to attack, the global metaphysical goodness. It's like in Dostoevsky, who also like to stress that uh, the history has this metaphysical dimension. So Putin somehow continues, I think, somehow this line, maybe not necessarily Paul's, but maybe Dostoevsky's or Ilyine's, whom he appreciates
Yeah,
much
yeah. I
more.
wanted to ask you. Sorry, you just mentioned this
Yeah,
Ilyin. I mean, Ivan Ilyin, which was a very interesting figure. And
yeah,
again, as Tim Snyder argued, right, his influence was tremendous. I mean, if you just go and check the random quotes by Ivan Ilyin, the fact of the matter is that fascism is the redemptive excess of patriotic
yeah,
arbitrariness, and you name it.
yeah,
This sort of this prayer of the kind of nationalism
yeah,
intertwined with neutralizing enemy and sort of this
yeah,
KGB apparatchik sort of conversations is amazing. And I'm wondering, what's your take on these influences also? What
yeah,
shaped him? And you
yeah.
mentioned Ivan Ilin, who is absolutely very important part.
Exactly. Well, and again, as everything that Putin does and thinks about, it's very superficial and fragmentary. He's not really trained in in humanities, and I wish he could be trained in humanities much better. And I'd like to make a footnote here in apology in support of systematic humanitarian education. Why it is needed? Why not just physics or law or whatever are needed? Because if we don't have proper fundamental humanitarian education, we have people like Putin in power, crazy people with very superficial ideas about humanities, but who are sure that they know it very well. So Putin, like with history, so with Ilyin, I believe, or the Russian religious philosophy of the time, of that era, has a very superficial understanding, I think, of those things. And certainly, yes, Ilyin was an orthodox thinker. He was also in a right-wing thinker, and again, it was not a unique thing. I identify this kind of layer of the Russian religious philosophy of the 20th century as the philosophy or theology, political theology of the 30s. Many political theologians in the 1930s uh, made the same statements as Elian and believed in the same way. They believed in the collapse of the corrupted, left wing ideologies like socialism or even more communism, and they looked for alternatives to those ideologies. And Ilyin, I think what is most liked by Putin in Ilyin is the idea that there is no a universal political model for all nations. Each nation has its own preferable models, and Russia is certainly is more in favor of monarchical model. And again, Ilyin stressed that he's not talking about the traditional hereditary monarchy of the Romanovs in Russia. It can be any sort of monarchical rule, meaning one man rule. It can be an elected person endorsed by someone like Hitler, who was elected democratically. So I think this is an idea that appeals to Putin, certainly. Um, and this combination of political ideas, especially from the ideologies of the 30s, and religious ideas, plus a good deal of superstition, just plain religious superstition, contribute and play their role in the formation of a very interesting uh, worldview of Putin. His kind of world, which consists of the elements of religion, politics, philosophy, history. It's very eclectic. It's very postmodernistic, if you want. It's not systematic. If you start analyzing what he believes, you understand it's just nonsense. I mean, it doesn't make sense if you treat it as as a specialist, as a scholar in those fields. But they work very good for for ordinary people. In this sense, I believe Putin is a populist. He's quite a populist, and I think there was a turn in Putin's um, political kind of evolution uh, from one role to another role. One role that he played in the beginning, essentially after he was not elected, promoted to power, or propelled to power after the resignation of Yeltsin, was the role, let me say, like Arabic sheikhs. He was an Arabic sheikh whose point was the following: look, I'm enlightened. I know how to do things right, like they do it in the West. But my people cannot understand it. My people will want to destroy you, the West. I'm the person who can contain them. I'm the mediator between my people, whom I understand well, and they trust me, and you, the Western powers. So I'm like an enlightened, absolutist leader who can manage my people, and I do not allow the evil powers within my people to harm you. And then at some point, he changed to a different model. That okay, you want me to be a democratic leader to represent my people. I will not contain my people anymore. I will be speaking on their behalf. I will represent and channel their will as I understand it. And this understanding exactly, it doesn't, essentially, Putin doesn't think about the Russian people high. But in the beginning, his point was, I want to contain this wild, sometimes evil substance of the Russian kind of psyche, right? Now he says, no, I'm going to represent it. I'm going to promote, to protect it. I'm going to speak and act on its behalf. Then at some stage, there was another transformation from thinking about the Russian people not high, and maybe assuming that the Russian psyche contains those evil, demonic powers, like demons. Putin came to think in the dualistic terms, as I described in my blog, that essentially the Russian psyche is like, what the Stoics called, of course, Putin probably doesn't know Stoics and doesn't know Stoic philosophy. I try to articulate what he probably thought in the terms of the Stoic philosophy, what the Stoics thought of as the cosmic soul, something rational, good, better than the rest of the world. And essentially, Putin, who originally believed that the West is wiser and kinder and better than Russia, came to believe the opposite, that the West is much worse than what Russia is. And he evolved to an extremal kind of perception of this dichotomization between Russia and world, dichotomization to which probably he was initiated or was strengthened in this initiation by reading the Russian religious philosophers, who also describe the world in those dichotomic terms, especially this controversy between the Slavophiles and the Westerners in the 19th century, which continued later on in the 20th century. And Ilyin was a part of this conversation about the role of the Russia, and he perceived the world in the same dichotomic terms as many Russian philosophers of his time did, even though, of course, he did not do this with those grief, dangerous political implications that Putin does. But essentially, Putin thinks in the same lines of the old Slavophile Westerners dilemma: us or the West, us versus West, never us together with the West. And he began to think, he switched somehow from considering the West as wise and kind, and Russia being not wise and needing containment, to the opposite, that Russia is really the incarnation of the cosmic goodness, and the West as fundamentally, intrinsically distrustful, something bad, something evil that needs to be contained. Now, it's not the Russian people who needs to be contained, it's the West. And that's exactly what he tries to do in Ukraine. He believes that Ukraine is possessed by the West, that Ukraine is a part of Russia, a piece of Russia, which became trapped in this Western framework. And essentially, what Putin fights is his earlier version of himself, because that's exactly what the early Putin believed, that it's good for Russia to be framed, by the Western civilization, to be a part of the Western civilization. Well, it became, in a sense, by integrating, through money and bribes and financial resources to the West, to the Western elites. But essentially, what Putin fights now, I want to repeat it, is what he earlier believed about Russia. And he sees it in Ukraine, and he really detests it. He tries to save Ukraine, and to save Ukraine from the mistakes that he himself did probably in the past. Yes, I know it may sound a bit speculative, but whatever we say about Putin will be a speculation. We will know about him, his beliefs, his ideas, including his religious, probably, ideas after he dies. And I wish we know about this sooner than later. But yes, it's unavoidable to speculate about him, and this is my take, my speculation about him.
And my question will be, I think you're running out of time because you have another meeting, so you have some time left. So what's the future of this whole thing? I mean, in sociology, we of course hate to say go get into the futurism and foreseeing things. Nobody foresaw this invasion. Nobody was saying it's possible, and we were of course all deceived by this weird maneuvering of Putin in a way. But actually, what you're talking about makes a lot more sense in a way if you look at it as more a guy who's obsessed with ideas. Because the way Western people look at it is a super pragmatic, rational actor. And invading Ukraine in such form actually does not make rational sense. And what you're saying is that, well, he believes in certain things obsessively, and those beliefs are in his kind of cosmology or epistemology of how things he understands and how he knows what he knows. And this is even more scary because he's not easily to kind of prognosticate. He's unpredictable because it's based on his beliefs of history and what you describe as kind of eclectic knowledge of different domains of humanity, but in a very unsystematic way. And then, of course, it creates a lot of misconceptions about how we, the people who study Russian studies or a region, kind of see what he will do or not. But it's actually based on his assertions, so certain sort of idea systems in a way, which are again so out of this world at times and unsubstantiated. So my question will be, of course, based on what we said, what's kind of the global picture of this? What is the maybe the bigger sort of output to which it leads to, and what are the plausible scenarios of this whole thing? Because one thing I thought personally was that probably he will go on the model of North Korea and South Korea, and one part will be divided and isolated, being part of the Russian Empire, whatever form that is, and the other will be Halichina will be left to the other sort of influences. And maybe he wanted this isolation. Maybe he wants it to be not. He's not afraid of sanctions, and this doesn't come as surprise. But actually, he really wants the sanctions to be completely isolated, and then go and hunt down each of these former Soviet countries and invade all of them separately, and then basically restore this whole North Korea deal. So this was my theory that probably this is where it's gonna go, unless there is a significant response which Putin considers as meaningful. So what do you think? What is this going to?
Yes, I think. Let me put in this way. First, yes, what you thought shared by many, including myself. Like we believe that yes, maybe Putin want to carve in into the eastern parts of Ukraine. Doesn't want to go to the west, but he started bombarding the western parts of Ukraine. Like my family is now just next to the Polish border, and they go to the shelter all the time because of the sirens. He sends his unmanned aircrafts and his planes to as far as to the Polish border, very close. And who knows what will happen? Well, one moment they may cross the airborne space of the NATO. It may happen anytime, and it is very plausible now. What I think Yes, what I want to stress in line with your reflection, with your question, is that yes, Putin is pragmatic. There was a joke, and I told the joke myself that there are three things in which people in the Kremlin believe. One thing is money, another thing is money, and guess what is the third thing? The money again. And this money pragmatism, this neoliberal, essentially, even though probably they don't know the word and the concept, but this is a very neoliberal approach, which some European countries demonstrate nowadays, like Germany, I believe. I don't want to to point the finger, but I have to sometimes. Putin is a neoliberal in this regard, very pragmatic. At the same time, he is a fatalist. This sort of Russian fatalist that described by by Lermontov, I don't know, those Russian poets, who, yes, they seem to be all right, like doing very good career, like officers, like in Lermontov's poems in pieces, and then they like go and shoot themselves, and destroy the world around them. Putin does it in the global on the global scale, and I think another thing that we can say about him that he believes in ideas and he's framed by ideas. He is an idiocratic person. He has idiocracy in the sense, yes, he has ideas which go beyond his interests, like pragmatic interests, and more dangerously, those ideas possess him. It's not that he, operates ideas. The problem is that the ideas operate him. And this is a kind of idiocracy which crazily, schizophrenically coexists with his ultimate pragmatism, with his neoliberal kind of approach to things, and which makes him dangerous, really. But I think it is necessarily to understand this ideological frame that possesses him, because then he becomes more predictable.